Good evening, comrades. Thank you very much for joining us. Sorry, somebody's just started drilling next door. We're very pleased to have Moshé Machover with us tonight, a founder of Matzpen and Israeli socialist, to discuss the situation in Israel, which is hugely interesting for an outsider like me anyway. It looks hugely interesting and vibrant. We've had 3 months of protests, culminating over the weekend in a general strike, the biggest upheaval in Israeli society since its foundation. So it says a lot about, I think, the Israeli society, how it's structured at the moment, and what how the protests are spreading like a wildfire, with very few Palestinian flags on it. It's all centered on those proposed reforms to the judicial system, which Moshé will explain to us some more. But we also want to look at the question, and maybe I'll talk to Moshé about this a bit later, about what socialists should do, which attitude we should take towards these protests. I've seen, if you're on social media, you'll get two extremes. I think you get some people who are saying we should have nothing to do with them because the Supreme Court in Israel is responsible for, keeping the occupation of Palestinian territories alive and the oppression of Palestinians, while others are arguing, well, this is a democratic movement in change, all things could open up, etc., etc. So a lot of interesting issues to talk about. Moshé will give an introduction of about 40 minutes, and then I might ask him some questions, and we can open up for questions from the floor. If you have a question, please click raise hand or put it in the Q&A, and I can read it out for you. Over to you, Moshé. Thanks for joining us.
Oh, thank you for inviting me. What I'm going to say can only be regarded as provisional because things are still not finalized by any means. The November 1st election in Israel and the formation subsequently of the extremist present government has put in motion several interconnected explosive processes. I spoke online at the online communist forum on the 5th of February, and I spoke about one of these explosive processes, the turbocharged oppression in the occupied territories, the intensification of oppression and the killing. I made several predictions about this intensification that were tragically proved right by the brutal Israeli military assassination raids into Nablus and Jenin and elsewhere, and the horrific pogrom in Hawara on the 26th of February. Today, in this webinar, I would like to address another explosive process that was triggered off by the new government, the internal Israeli crisis of the ruling class. This is how I'm going to describe it. It is a crisis of the Jewish bourgeoisie, which is the ruling class in Israel. It is obviously, as I try to explain, an internal crisis of this class. I will address several points: the scale of the protest, the scale of the schism, the nature of the two camps fighting each other, the nature of the class struggle in Israel, the issue which is about which the conflict takes place, the militarist aspect of the conflict on at least one side of it, the role of the Israeli armed forces in this conflict. And finally, I'd like to say something about the point that Tina referred to. What attitude should socialists take towards this conflict? Okay. I have in fact spoken about this protest movement also on the online communist forum on the 19th of this month. But what I'm going to say now will be to some extent similar but updated, because things have moved on considerably since then. So first of all, the scale is unprecedented. The scale of the protest, if you have seen images of this, which were quite widespread in the media, for 12 weeks in succession, mass demonstrations were taking place, reaching unprecedented scale, not only in Israel, but I mean, if you compare it, if you scale it up to the size of the population, in Israel, they reached the peak of about 500,000, counting the whole country. I mean, the main demonstration may be in Tel Aviv, then Jerusalem, Haifa, and elsewhere. Altogether, 500,000 people. If you scale it to British scale, it would be like demonstrations of 2.5 million in Britain. Now, what were they about? I mean, the demands of the mainstream of the demonstration, and I want to stress there is the mainstream of the demonstration, but the demonstrations have been joined by other people who make their own separate demands, which are not the same as the ones raised by the organizers, the people who are really the moving spirit behind the mainstream demonstration. So the mainstream demands are, first of all, opposition to the proposed legalization, mainly the proposed reforms in the legal system, in the judiciary, and especially in the Supreme Court, disempowering it, making it much less powerful than it is at present, and also making the choice, the selection of judges the gift of the government, which it is not the case at the moment. The government has some role in selecting the Supreme Court judges, but it is not able to dictate. It doesn't have the veto. It has a veto, but not the power to completely on its own designate the Supreme Court judges. In addition, there are also a whole raft of proposed laws in illiberal, autocratic and theocratic direction, making Israel an overtly illiberal autocracy. Legislation against LGBT people, and also legislation which would make these changes irreversible. I will explain this. In order to reverse the present government, in order, let us say, to bring the opposition, the present opposition, back into office, they would need the votes of the mainly Arab parties. But the proposed legislation threatens to make the Arab parties incapable of, unable to run for the Knesset. And this would make the rule of the extreme right in Israel permanent. Perhaps it was a mistake on the part of the present government to make this raft of legislation huge, sort of a huge amount of regressive reactionary legislation all at once. In other countries where move against so-called liberal democracy has taken place, if you take as an example Hungary or Poland, this has been done little by little, step by step, and it was much more difficult to challenge these relatively small steps in the way they have been challenged by the massive demonstrations in Israel, which were triggered by the fact that the change proposed, the legislation change proposed by the present government has been so massive that it really frightened their opponents. Now, as I mentioned, the present crisis is a class struggle. What you have seen on your screens on the media. Well, I mean, if you didn't know what it was about, you could easily imagine it was a revolution. I mean, the massive, the scale of the demonstrations, the persistence, the fact that at the very last stage it was it included the general strike of the labor federation in Israel, the involvement of the military, about which I will speak. All this looks like a revolution. Of course, it isn't a revolution, but it is a class struggle, not a struggle between the working class and the bourgeoisie. It is a struggle between two sections of the Israeli ruling class, the Jewish bourgeoisie, and I can make it easier to understand, at least in part, by drawing a sort of analogy. Now, of course, please understand that when I'm talking about the protesting side, those who challenge the government, I'm talking about the core. The core has been joined by a lot of other people who have their own demands and their own agenda. But if you look at the actual agenda of the main protagonists, then it is a struggle between the populist section of the bourgeoisie, represented by the present government, and the so-called liberal bourgeoisie. And I ask you, when I speak about the liberal bourgeoisie, to put very heavy scare quotes around liberal, because it is liberal only in its facade, but it is not liberal in any substantive sense. And I say this, if you compare an analogous to a confrontation, for example, in the United States or in Hungary or in Poland, between the the populist ruling class and the liberal section of the bourgeoisie, even there, liberal is not, not in reality liberal. It is liberal in pretense, to a great extent. But this is much more so in the case of Israel, as I will explain further on. The populist bourgeoisie, and I think in this there is quite a lot of similarity with the United States. In other countries, such as Hungary and Poland, the populist bourgeoisie is in alliance with religious fundamentalism, as it is in the United States, as it is in Israel. There is a very strong and deep-going alliance between the populist bourgeoisie and the religious fundamentalists. And also, as is typical, really, of a populist bourgeoisie, it appeals and gets quite a lot of support from sections of the working class. And this is the case, obviously, as you know, with Trumpism in the United States, with the Hungarian populist bourgeoisie. And so it is in Israel as well. But as I will try to explain, there is in the liberal bourgeoisie in Israel shares some aspects with its counterparts in other countries. It is white in Israeli terms, Ashkenazi, and has pretense to liberal values, which makes the term liberal bourgeoisie applicable. But it has a very specific Israeli character, which I will try to explain, and which has made the evolution of the protest and its present situation understandable, and that is the militaristic character of the so-called liberal bourgeoisie in Israel, of the opposition. The leading forces behind the protests in Israel have a heavy militaristic character. Okay, I will return to this further on, but you can see that even the way the protests have been organized, and they are not entirely spontaneous, there is an organization behind them, and you can see they are very well organized, almost as a military operation. And this is not accidental, because there is a heavy involvement of militarism behind this protest. Now, what are the issues about which the conflict is centered? The regime of colonial Jewish supremacy in Israel is hiding in plain sight behind the facade of fake democracy. There is a sort of facade of Israel being a liberal democracy, there are elections, there is a powerful Supreme Court, there are laws about human rights and so on. However, this is to a very large extent a facade, not a reality. Consider this: 36% of the population under Israeli rule has no rights at all. I'm referring, of course, to the Palestinians in the occupied territories of the West Bank and Gaza. That's 36% of the, roughly, I'm using here approximate figures. So 36% of the population has no rights at all. 14% has some rights, but a very curtailed, civil rights. There is, in fact, a regime of Jewish supremacy, but it hides under a cloak of a supposed liberal democracy. There is the fiction of a two-state solution, which the liberal democracy adheres to. Of course, it is a complete illusion, and it has been an illusion for many, many decades. In fact, I co-written an article in the 1970s explaining why the two-state solution is a deception. It is not going to happen. Israel is not going to allow it. But the liberal bourgeoisie is still happy to adhere to this fiction. It has a powerful Supreme Court. Israel has a powerful Supreme Court. Of course, it has used its power mostly in entrenching the regime of Jewish supremacy. It has given very little protection to the civil rights of Israeli citizens who are Arabs, let alone to the Palestinian Arab population of the occupied territory. There is a very rare, there are very rare cases where it actually rules in favor of Palestinians. It has allowed Israel to perpetrate what are internationally war crimes, collective punishment, assassinations, moving, of course, the very act of Israeli colonization of these territories, it's moving Israeli citizens to colonize these occupied territories is prohibited under the international law. All this is hiding behind another part of the facade. As you may know, Israel does not allow the description of these occupied territories as occupied territories. Israel denies, in fact, that the occupied territories are occupied territories. And this has had the stamp of the Israeli Supreme Court. The reason is, of course, that if Israel admits that these are occupied territories, then it would be obliged to apply the international law governing occupied territories. On the other hand, its accuse was this is our land. How can we be occupiers of our own land? God gave it to us. It is ours by divine right. On the other hand, Israel denies that it has actually annexed these occupied territories. They have been annexed de facto, but Israel and the Supreme Court has given its stamp to this, its approval to this, that these are disputed territories, neither occupied nor annexed. This enables Israel to maintain the facade of liberal democracy, which of course governs only 50% of the total population of the area under Israeli control. Why is this so important for the liberal bourgeoisie? Well, it is important because this pretense of Israel being a liberal democracy, it actually enables it to apply a draconic regime to the occupied territories. The pretense allows Israel's international friends, the United States amongst them chiefly the United States, but also other camp followers of the United States, including Britain, to pretend that Israel is a liberal democracy. The draconic rule is not in Israel, it is in the occupied territories. Of course, Israel does not regard them as occupied territories, it is somewhere else, as it were. Let me quote a recent statement by a former Israeli ambassador to South Africa, Arthur Lenk. This was published just yesterday in Haaretz. One of Israel's most successful calling cards is being a democracy and a liberal open society in a really difficult neighborhood. That's what he said. The judicial coup attempt that's been going on for the last 3 months whittled that sympathy away. It's a big challenge. So I have lots of sympathy for my friends all over the world who are literally holding up Israel's flag in these challenging times. Daniel Shapiro, who served as US ambassador to Israel under the Obama administration, also quoted yesterday in Haaretz. If the Israeli government were to go down a path where a large number of its own citizens and many fellow democracies in other countries really question whether Israel was still adhering to those democratic principles of rule of law, separation of powers, and checks and balances, it will obviously be detrimental to the close bond between the US and Israel. That's in Haaretz yesterday. Well, this is just almost a random sample of similar statements by Israel's so-called friends. You understand what is behind this. It is not that if there is a rightward regime change in Israel, that the United States will stop supporting it. The reason the United States is a staunch supporter of Israel is because Israel is a strategic asset of the United States. But it will make it more difficult in front of the public opinion in the United States and in other countries. It will make it harder to take a friendly attitude to Israel and to support what it is doing if it is ostensibly and clearly not a liberal democracy. It is in reality not a liberal democracy, but it is hiding behind such a facade. And the facade is very, very important. It is very important for the relationship of the Israeli ruling class with its cognates in other countries and for its own self-image. In contrast, the populist bourgeoisie is typically crude. I mean, this is very similar to what you saw in the United States under Trump. Under his rule, the ruling class was pursuing the same interest, but in a more crude way and with less sensitivity to the opinions of its allies in other countries. The populist bourgeoisie is typically, in Israel, is typically crude. They don't want the mask. They want a completely powerless Supreme Court, open official annexation of the occupied territory, official rather than unofficial. De facto, they want de jure annexation. They have long stated their open objection to the two-state deception. They want open apartheid, open official apartheid, not only as it is now in the occupied territories, but also openly inside Israel itself. I have mentioned also one of their aims, and that is disenfranchisement of Israeli Arabs, of the Palestinian Arab citizens of Israel, and eventual ethnic cleansing. They are not trying to hide their wish to eventually lead to ethnic cleansing of Israel and also open concession to religious fundamentalism. Let me give you an example of why it is important for the liberal bourgeoisie to hide behind a liberal facade. The role of the Supreme Court and the judicial system in Israel is crucial in this respect. This is the shield that shields Israeli top military people and top politicians from being prosecuted in front of the International Criminal Court. You know, the International Criminal Court in The Hague has a fundamental principle. It doesn't look into cases where the country in which the alleged offense is being perpetrated, if in that country there is an internal system that investigates such crimes. In Israel, at the moment, there is such a system. Ostensibly, the Supreme Court and in general, the judicial system in Israel supposedly investigates crimes against Palestinians, assassinations and various violent actions against them, except that it does very little against them, only in very, very rare occasions. But generally, it lets the perpetrators off. However, if the Supreme Court is emasculated, if as Ben-Gvir, the present Minister of National Security, who is a known long-term supporter of mass murderers, predominantly the perpetrator of the massacre in the Hebron Mosque, Baruch Goldstein, that was one of his heroes. He demands giving immunity to Israeli personnel, who military and police personnel who are accused of crimes against Palestinians. That is to say, if an Israeli soldier shoots and kills a Palestinian, as in the case of Akle, the Palestinian journalist, where it was obviously murder, then they should not be prosecuted. They should have immunity. Now, the liberal bourgeoisie, many of its members are themselves senior military and political personalities, is afraid that this removes the shield that the present judicial system gives them against being prosecuted by the International Criminal Court. Of course, Ben-Gvir doesn't really mind. His appeal is mainly to working class Israeli soldiers and policemen who are not going to be prosecuted in The Hague anyway. They are too junior in order to be in danger of prosecution. So you can see in this just single illustration, you can see the importance to the Israeli liberal bourgeoisie of being shielded by the facade of liberal democracy inside Israel. I think my time is getting short, so I'll just end by focusing on another very important point, the role of the military. As in every revolution, putsch or coup d'etat, a crucial question is what is the position of the armed forces? This is also a key question in the present crisis in Israel, and the answer to it is a specific singular Israeli one. There is a heavy presence of military personnel within the liberal bourgeoisie. It is not, I'm not referring to the professional armies, that is to say, those who are serving soldiers as their profession. I'm talking to people who are reserve officers in the Israeli military forces. Israel has traditionally relied very heavily on reservists. In the past, even the ground forces were heavily reliant on regular service every year, up to 30 or 40 days of people who are no longer serving in the army, but are civilians. They are called up for reserve duty. They used to be called up 1 month a year. This is no longer the case for ordinary ground forces, for infantry, for tanks, and so on. But it is the case for elite sections of the Israeli military forces. Combat pilots, cyber operatives, command and control people, intelligence. These are the military doctors. They are called very regularly. For example, the elite unit of a squadron of the Israeli Air Force, Squadron 69, is called, I mean, these are civilians. They may be business people. They may be CEOs of various corporations, or holding various other positions of middle class positions, but they are called regularly and very frequently to reserve duty in order to keep them in shape. Let me quote from the Wikipedia about Squadron 69. They are specialists in long-range and endurance operations. These people are called up sometimes for 1 day a week, every week, for retraining to keep them in shape. What is their importance? These capabilities, the Wikipedia tells us, it places 69 Squadron at the forefront of Israel's strategic arm, and it is thus this unit that is reputed to have undertaken Operation Orchard, the destruction of a Syrian nuclear site in September 6, 2007. The squadron has also been linked to a possible Israeli strike against the Iranian nuclear program. So you can see this is a highly important part of the Israeli Air Force. Now, the interesting fact about Squadron 69 is that a few weeks ago, its reservists were called up for a retraining day. 37 out of 40 reserve pilots of this elite squadron refused to turn up for training. They are involved actually as a leading part of the protest movement. And the same applies to other elite forces, intelligence, cyber, medical doctors, intelligence, both military intelligence and the Israeli counterpart of the MI6, that is the Mossad, and MI5, the Shabak, the Shin Bet. They are heavily involved, and you can see why Israel's facade of liberal democracy is important to these people, both as self-protection and also as self-image. It is not by chance that the event that triggered the retreat, the temporary retreat of the Israeli government under Netanyahu was the sacking, the dissent of Israel's Minister of Defense, Yoav Gallant. Why him? Well, he is under pressure because he is in the receipt of all the feedback that he gets from the Israeli chief of staff, who is aware of the revolt and resentment among senior military people, not in active service necessarily. Some also have joined it, but those in reserve, which the Israeli military heavily relies on. He has been another dissident within the present government is Yuli Edelstein, who also has a key position because he's head of the Knesset committee in charge of foreign and military affairs. So you can see where this is leading. I've exhausted my time, and I can address questions about what attitude one should take towards the protest in reply to questions and discussion. So I'll stop here and leave the stage to Tina.
Thank you very much, Moshe. Have you had a drink yet? Have a drink yet? I was going to ask you a few questions as well, if that's okay. Oh, you got a drink, good. Fascinating overview. I think that's really explained very, very well the tension. So it's a class struggle, but it's within one class, within the ruling class, a more liberal wing, as you put it, a liberal wing and a more populist wing. Now, it's interesting that we understand that in exchange for postponing this proposed legislation a month into the next legislature, legislative period, Netanyahu had to promise the setting up of an armed defense unit under Ben Gvir's leadership.
Militia.
Yeah,
A militia,
basically.
actually a militia directed quite openly against Palestinians, especially Palestinian citizens of Israel. This is an internal militia that he has promised him, especially in mixed towns where there is a mixed population. There are several towns in Israel where the population includes, either a majority or a big minority of Palestinian Arab citizens. Jaffa is one example where there is a sizable minority still of Palestinian Arabs, Lod, Lida, and other places. And Ben Gvir wants his own fascist. I think that the term fascist is suitable in this. I haven't called the present government fascist as other people do. I think this is an inaccurate. But in this case of armed militias against part of the population, this is a known fascist instrument. And yes, Netanyahu, who is in fact captive in the hands of his extreme right-wing partners, a position he's not used to. He's used to be sort of in the middle between right, extreme right, and not so extreme right. And he's now capitulated to this demand.
How serious do you, I mean, this is supposed to be a long-term or permanent fixture then, this militia. Do you believe that is going to last?
I think if it is implemented, which is not clear, it is not clear that Netanyahu is going to stay in office. We can talk about the projected developments, what is going to happen later on. I haven't made any conjectures about how the situation is going to develop. But if we try to make a prognosis, if the present government remains in power and this project of Ben Gvir's militia is going to be implemented, this is highly dangerous to Palestinian citizens of Israel and to leftists in the Jewish population.
I mean, it does look like it is heading for a collapse of the government. I mean, but you never know how these things play out. But this would be the 5th election, I think, since 2015, or even the 6th election. I mean, this is a society clearly in deep crisis that can't be governed at the moment.
I hesitate to look. When you make weather forecasts, it's easier and more accurate to make immediate forecasts. I mean, what is going to happen tomorrow? When it comes to what is going to happen next month, it's much less accurate. In this case, I think it's the other way around. I find it much more difficult to forecast what is going to happen immediately. But I have my own assessment what is probably going to happen in the longer term. And we can talk about this. I think it is too soon to write Netanyahu off. He is a master of maneuvering. He is going to do whatever is in his power to stay in office. His not only political life depends on it, but also his life outside prison depends on it, because we haven't spoken about this. What has triggered off all this process of 5 elections in so many years, 4 elections, of this exacerbation of a crisis that was actually in the offing. It was predictably going to happen in sooner or later. He brought it sooner because of his wish to stay out of prison. He's in charge of being charged with, and he's actually standing on trial for various charges of corruption and abuse of powers and so on. So and he has managed to maneuver so far to stay out of jail. Who knows? I mean, he may survive this crisis somehow. Ideally, he would like to make a new coalition with some of the opposition, with for example, with Benny Gantz national movement, so-called, which is a fairly right-wing part of the opposition, and possibly with the Yair Lapid's Yesh Atid, there is a future party. The difficulty is that he has cheated them so many times. He has made so many agreements with them, and mainly sort of left them in the lurch. He has lied to them so many times that they would be stupid to accept his overtures this time. It is also quite likely that if they try to make these people who are leaders of the parliamentary opposition in Israel are not actually leading the protest movement. They are invited to speak on it. It would be a mistake if people think that the protest movement, the huge protest, is led by the parliamentary opposition. They are mistaken. They are supporting it. They are called to speak to it, but they are not leading it. They are not planning it. And I think that the leadership of the protest will apply heavy pressure on them not to compromise. The main medium, public medium of the protest is the Israeli newspaper Haaretz. It's if you like, among the printed media is identifiably the newspaper of the protest. They have already warned these people not to be tempted by Netanyahu's possible attempts to lure them into an alternative coalition. So who knows? I mean, he may not survive. If you want me to make a more longer term prognosis, then I'm ready to do it.
Okay, that's fine. One question though, before I bring in Ian from the floor, one other question, which was interesting to, you outlined that they need the veneer of democracy so that the US can relatively easy support Israel, because it needs Israel in the Middle East as its, you know, trusted ally, especially with perhaps another world war coming up. I mean, that would strike me as even more important that you have somebody, a government in the Middle East that you can do business with. And we know the rest of the Middle East is more volatile like that. How much pressure do you think is coming from Biden, from Macron, from Scholz on Israel at the moment to end this and, you know, return to some stable government? And do they actually help these protesters, you think? Are they sort of, you know, fueling those protests a little bit from the outside in order to keep that veneer going?
Yes and no. First of all, American pressure was quite evident, and I think in this morning's or yesterday New York Times, there was an article which went into detail about the heavy pressure from the United States, especially after the sacking of the Minister of Defense, Yoav Gallant, and the exacerbation of the conflict, the declaration by the Histadrut of a general strike. Yes, there was heavy pressure, but funnily enough, a few hours ago, I read that Bibi Netanyahu has been invited to Washington for talks with the president. What they are going to talk about and what Biden is going to say to Netanyahu is anybody's guess. But this is a turnaround for quite some time, and very, very ostensive, very, very openly, Biden avoided inviting Netanyahu to Washington, which would have been expected. I mean, from a newly formed government. After the formation of this present government, Biden has not invited Netanyahu, and that was commented on. There was pressure. What importance this pressure had on Netanyahu's decision to do the thing for which he sacked his defense minister. I mean, the defense minister, Yoav Gallant, said that the legislation should be frozen, not prevented at all, not an all-out retreat, but just stopped for a while. For this, he was sacked. And then, after a few hours, Netanyahu said that he was going to do exactly that. This is an indication of the dire straits he's finding himself in, the pressure. It took him quite a while to persuade his extreme right-wing partners to agree to it. Anyway, so American pressure may have possibly did play an important part in his his U-turn. Whether this was the decisive factor, who knows? But it was part of the reason that he made this retreat.
Interesting. Thank you, Moshe. David Rosenberg, Glenn Secker, and Yosef Farjoun have put questions in the Q&A. Comrades, if you want to come in to ask these, please click raise hand under reactions. If not, I'll just read out the questions later. But first, Ian, please. Thank you.
Good evening, Moshe, and good evening, comrades. I'd just like to ask a few questions about what we might call the political economy of the Israeli Defense Forces. How does the country afford such a huge military infrastructure? What part is played by the Israeli defense industry? Who buys their weapons? What proportion of the huge amount of resources that must go into the Israeli Defense Forces, what proportion of that is generated from the social surplus within Israel itself? That's it.
Thank you, Ian. I suggest we collect a few questions because we're trying to finish by 7:30. So I'm going to take a few other comrades still first. Steve, please.
Thank you, Tina, and hello, Moshe. It's good to see you again. I haven't seen you for a while, so it's nice to see you. So just to go over what I think I've understood from what you said. So there is, from my perspective, a crisis of democracy, even though Israel is as you say, a kind of pretend liberal democracy, a pretense of it. But obviously it's got to have some substance. Even a pretense has to have, you've got to have elections and there's proportional representation. So, but it's got the pretense in the same way as we've got a bit of a pretense going on here, as we know. It doesn't have a written constitution. My understanding is that that's because it's almost too divisive to try to establish one, because it opens up all the problems. If you try to write something down on a piece of paper, it would be problematic. So, but you've got a constitution in practice rather than in a written document. And it seems to me that Israel is on the road to fascism, but it obviously is not there. But fascism doesn't come on one day, does it? It's a step by step, gaining confidence at each step, successfully moving the whole thing forward. it doesn't get to fascism without crushing all democracy, all liberal democracy and the working class, but it's not there yet. But it seems to me, therefore, that what you've now got in going on that road is you've got a revolutionary crisis, which is not the same as a revolution. In other words, you've got the mass movement on the streets and it's a constitutional dispute, a constitutional split within the ruling class, as you described it. It's a bit more 1905 than 1917 because the old regime hasn't been overthrown. So I think, therefore, what should we be saying? What should people be saying? Well, as a Republican and an internationalist, I think that Marx's famous dictum that a nation that oppresses another cannot itself be free is obviously very, very important in all of this. So we cannot forget about the Palestinians, but also to remember that 20% of the working class is Arab. And so we have to put forward an independent way forward for the working class movement and fight for that in the movement. And that would mean that it's the case for a democratic and secular republic, a constituent assembly, a withdrawal from the occupied territories, a new written constitution, and the democratic organization of citizens in the army, so that there's there's a complete democratization that one should be arguing for. And you might say, well, that's not socialism, but this isn't a socialist movement. But socialism can grow in those circumstances. So a socialist and working class movement can be strengthened. So I just put that forward, the idea that we need a democratic program for a democratic movement, a democratic secular. A secular program means not a Jewish state, by the way, just to emphasize that point, not a continuation of the Jewish Zionist state.
Thank you, Steve. Moshé, do you want to reply now or collect a few more?
Yes, I think there's plenty here, especially in the last contribution.
Go on.
Israel's defense budget, how can it finance? Israel is economically very successful. The Israeli economy is in very good shape. It doesn't mean that the Israeli workers are in very good shape, because there is an extreme degree of inequality in the distribution of income and property. But Israel has a budget surplus, a sizable budget surplus. It is perfectly able to finance its military budget. It is getting help from the United States, quite massive help, but it is not decisive. That is to say, that in budgetary terms, it is not a crucial part of the Israeli state budget. This is a relatively small proportion, maybe 2% of the Israeli military budget. It is reliant on this military help from the assistance from the United States, is in terms of its ability to buy certain equipment which it cannot make itself in the United States. Israel specializes in high-tech military production, both software and hardware, which it exports. Israel is one of the major exporters of military equipment to the rest of the world. But this is mostly high-tech. Israel does not export tanks or fighter aircraft or submarines. It needs to purchase these. Submarines it purchases from Germany. One of the accusations of corruptions against Netanyahu, for which he has not been put on trial as yet, is that he ordered too many for corrupt reasons, because some of his associates were getting a sort of commission on it. But that's the German aspect. But the military aircraft, fighter aircraft, tanks and so on, it gets from the United States. that is part of the deal. It gets military subventions from the United States, which it is mostly compelled or contracted to use by buying heavy military equipment in the United States. But financing the Israeli armed forces is not an extraordinarily heavy burden on the Israeli economy. It used to be in the past, but it's no longer the case. By the way, the high-tech industry is crucial in the Israeli economy. It is 25% of the Israeli economy is in this sector, and it provides for about 50% of Israeli exports. So Israel is heavily reliant on high tech. And of course, the people involved in high tech are among this section of the bourgeoisie, mostly among this section of the bourgeoisie, whom I've labeled as quote unquote liberal bourgeoisie, which also made it a credible threat on the government when these people actually participated overtly in the protest against the government. Okay, Israel is in a crisis of democracy, as Steve indicated. The fact that there are elections within Israel, I mean, these elections affect, as I explained, certainly they do not apply to 36% of the population under Israeli control. In South Africa, you also had, under apartheid, you also had elections, but elections mostly for whites, and under a separate curia for colored people. That didn't make South Africa under apartheid a democracy, let alone a liberal democracy. Okay, Israel does not have a constitution. It has, the reason why it doesn't have a constitution goes back to the very foundation of Israel. This is because it was impossible to write a constitution that would have satisfied both secular Israeli Jews, who are a majority still among the Jewish population of Israel, and the religious section. The role of religion was such a contentious issue that prevented, this was one of the reasons. Another reason, of course, the constitution would have had to say something about the civil and human rights of non-Jews, and this was a problem for the Zionist leaders of Israel. Instead, Israel has a series of basic laws which have the character of elements of a constitution. It is some of these fundamental laws or basic laws that the present government would like to annul or to weaken, because they do guarantee a certain amount of rights to non-Jews. As for what we should call for, it's very easy to formulate demands. I would, first of all, put as a basic demand for socialism. The question is not what demands we would like to see implemented, but what forces are able to carry them out. I've written many years ago an article entitled "Belling the Cat," which put forward, I mean, emphasizes the problem of agency. You know, this Aesop tale about the mice gathering and trying to figure out what to do about the cat, how to confront the cat, which is killing a lot of them. And one young mouse said, well, we should try and tie a bell around its neck, belling the cat, put a bell around its neck, and then we'll hear when the cat is coming and we can scuttle away. But then an old mouse said, yes, that's very good, but who is going to do it? Who is going to bell the cat? And I think this is a key question. In any case, among the demands that Steve mentioned, I think one was missing, or at least it wasn't emphasized. And this I would put first of all, and that is decolonization. The main problem which the present internal protests in Israel, or its leadership, is trying to avoid. Not all the participants, by the way. Some people have joined the demonstration with their own slogans against the occupation and so on. But decolonization of Israel-Palestine is the primary aim of any progressive, let alone socialist set of demands. The question is, who is going to do it? And I don't want to go into details here because it would require a separate meeting, but to be very brief, I don't think this can be done without the consent or even participation of the Israeli working class. The external forces are not able to overthrow the colonial regime, the Zionist regime of Israel, which is a colonial regime. This is a sharp difference from South Africa, where there was an internal force. The majority working class, which was indigenous, black working class, was able to overthrow the colonial regime. This is not the case in Israel. Israel is a different model of colonization, more like Australia or North America, where the indigenous population is not the source of labor power, is not a resource, but a surplus to requirement. It is the Israeli working class who is essential for overthrowing the Zionist regime. The question is, are they likely to do it? Not in the present situation of the area. I don't think that in the present configuration of the world and the region, the Israeli working class is likely to give up its privilege as an oppressed, exploited class, but in a privileged nation. It would require a socialist revolution to make it part of a ruling class of a no longer oppressive nation. But this would presuppose far-reaching developments in the region and in the world. I certainly believe that this will come one day, but will they come before the extreme right will actually strengthen its hold on Israel and perpetrate ethnic cleansing? I am afraid that I think it is probable that this latter thing will happen before Israel and the region is able to make the transformations that are needed in order to resolve the basic problems.
Yeah. I'm afraid I don't think we're going to finish by 7:30. So, Moshé, if it's okay with you, I think we're going to be running a bit over. We've got
it is now 7:15.
Yes, we've got 5 people who want to ask questions. Or
sorry,
No, it's all right. It's really interesting. I mean, that's why. So if you're okay with you, if it's okay with you, can I take those 5 and then you can perhaps reply to what you wish to reply, or if you want to come in between, you'll let me know. I don't want to,
Okay.
then you wanted. Okay, David Rosenberg, please.
Yeah. Hello, Moshé. Good to see you and good to hear you again. And thanks for the really, really, really brilliant analysis. I wanted to ask about something you just touched on there, which it's about part of the movement within the wider demonstration. And I understand and accept your characterization of the general nature of the demonstrations, but I'm aware through the social media that I'm seeing of what seems to be a growing anti-occupation bloc within the demonstrations, and I wanted to know more about that. Who are they? Are they the forces that have already been there? Are they bringing new people into their forces? Are they, and also the demands, like I've seen the demand democracy from the river to the sea, and that seems to me something a new slogan in terms of Israeli demonstration. So I wanted to find out more about that bloc.
Good question. Moshé, anytime you want to speak, you just raise your hand and I can bring you in. Sami Ramadani, please. Hi, comrade.
Hello, Sami.
Hello, Moshé. How are you? Sorry, Moshé, I missed the first half of your speech. My computer decided to go on strike at the wrong time. I don't know if you covered this issue. I was trying to follow Palestinian opinion today, and the reaction is mixed, but I think a majority would be sort of similar to what Hanan Ashrawi has been talking about today, that whenever there is a conflict within Israeli ruling circles, the compromise solution is always to hit the Palestinians. That the ideal compromise solution is always to find ways of satisfying the extreme right wing in Israeli society by further punishing the Palestinians. This seems to be the common factor that I gathered from Hanan Ashrawi and Noor Auda and other, especially women activists in occupied Palestine. So I wondered if you managed to follow some more Palestinian opinion.
Thank you, comrade. Glyn, please. Glyn Secker.
Oh, I thought
You are unmuted.
Can you hear me now? If the mute goes on and off. Yeah, okay. Just first of all, I'd like to say that I get this feeling that that America and Western allies will, in the end, reinstate business as usual in Israel, because this notional democracy is also very important to them. Because of the role that Israel plays for them. But what happens, as you say, in the immediate future is impossible to predict. But my question was very similar to David's. David asked about the voices that are criticising the occupation and wanting an end to the occupation. And my question was about what role have the radical left Jewish groups been playing in the movement, if any at all? I don't get much news here, and I'm afraid I don't read Hebrew, so I can't sort of scan the internal press. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Glenn. David Vickers, please.
Hi, comrades. Thank you. It was a very fascinating talk. I just wanted to ask about what Moshé thinks about the emerging Palestinian uprising and the sort of seeming drive towards an end of factionalism between the various competing factions in the Palestinian resistance movement and the formation of the new locally coordinated brigades, and whether, you know, the sort of development of a new intifada what impact that could have on the domestic political situation within Israel. Thanks.
Thank you, David. Ken Syme, please.
Thank you very much, Moshé. Just one question. What do you think the prospects are of a military coup against Netanyahu on the grounds of national unity, the failure of all political parties, etc., with possibly Netanyahu granted political asylum in the States so he doesn't come back from Washington? That may simply be the script of a bad political thriller, but I'd be interested in your view on that possible scenario. Thank you.
Can I come back on this fascinating question? First of all, the anti-occupation contingent in some of the demonstration, initially they were shooed away. They were not allowed, certainly not allowed to raise a Palestinian flag. But their slogans, democracy for all from the river to the sea, is not a new slogan. It is a slogan of the anti-occupation forces within Israel. Some of them are sort of left-wing Zionists who nevertheless are against the occupation, and others are anti-Zionist forces. Both Arab and Jewish. There is also a much larger part of the participants in the demonstration from whom you hear the following: yes, we are also against the occupation. We realize that the occupation is a poison that poisons Israeli political life, and we are against it. But don't bring this in now. Now we are concerned about resolving our internal problems. Once we resolve our internal problem and reinstitute a liberal democracy, then we can talk about dealing with the occupation. That is quite a common view that you can hear among supporters of the protests, but not the mainstream, who are not concerned at all with the occupation. In fact, they would like to preserve Israel as with a facade of liberal democracy, precisely in order to continue the oppression of the Palestinians in the occupied territories. What Sami said is absolutely correct. I mean, both sides in the main camps that I described would like to compromise at the expense. If they do compromise, finally, it will be at the expense of the Palestinians. It doesn't mean that the Palestinian population, especially within Israel, does not have any important role to play. If it plays its cards properly, it can gain something, not willingly conceded by either side, certainly not by the government, but the opposition will not easily concede, but as a measure of self-preservation, the opposition parties know that they cannot regain power in any way without the support of the Palestinian citizens of Israel. And this is a point through which the Palestinian citizens of Israel can gain some mileage. And of course, there is what some of them do, and I think rightly, they participate in the demonstrations with their own slogans and with their own flags. This is the right thing, and this is what the radical left, the anti-Zionist left, and some of the other parts of the left is doing in the demonstration. They come and join it with their own slogans. As for the question of military coup, is there a possibility of a military coup? In a sense, what has happened already is a military counter coup. If you like, the achievement of the protests so far is to a large extent a counter coup by a section of the army which I characterize as vital parts of the Israeli military force in reserve. I explained their crucial role for Israel's Air Force and other high-tech branches of the Israeli military and intelligence. So in a sense, they have managed to scuttle the attempts of the present government to implement quickly this regressive raft of legislation. I don't expect there to be a full-fledged military coup in Israel, not in the near or intermediate future. As for the Palestinian uprising, I've spoken about this in the meeting that I referred to earlier on the 5th of February. This is inevitably going to intensify for objective reasons, which is not really dependent on which Israeli government is in power, so long as it's a Zionist colonial regime. The present situation is unstable. The Palestinian under occupation are strong enough to resist it. They are not strong enough to overthrow it. The Israeli colonial regime is strong enough to fight and try to suppress it, but not strong enough to eliminate it. So this is a scenario for an intensifying conflict, which is going to be very bloody, in my opinion, and is developing in this direction of escalating oppression and resistance to oppression, which is not going to be resolved either way anytime soon. I think what this is leading to in the intermediate term is a catastrophic situation of another Nakba, an attempt by Israel, led by its extreme right, the forces behind the present government, to implement a major ethnic cleansing of the Palestinian situation. Sorry not to be too optimistic, but I think we should be open-eyed about the prospects of a developing situation. I think it is leading to a very bad place.
Thank you very much, Moshé. A fascinating session with over 100 people in the meeting and a few dozen watching online, and hundreds more will be watching it on the video, I'm sure. I think you were a bit pessimistic there towards the end, but I think it's really important to look at the positives as well. I mean, this is a revolutionary situations. A lot can happen. Things change like that. People change like that.
Yeah.
And you know, we are eternal optimists, aren't we? And perhaps, as Steve quoted Marx quite rightly, you know, the understanding that you can't be free if your government, if you oppress another nation, that means your nation can never be free.
And there are quite a lot of Israeli groups who are joining it, including, groups like Rabbis Against the Occupation.
Yes, indeed.
I mean, it's not only secular people. There are various civil society groups who are explicitly fighting. They are a minority, but they don't give up.
I think your attitude is exactly right. If we were in Israel now, we would get involved, wouldn't we? We would get involved with our own program, with our own flags, with our own demands.
That's what my comrades are doing in Israel.
Quite right.
They are joining with their own slogans, with their own demands.
I see some on the left who are just saying, you know, we're not touching that with a barge pole. You know, these are fascists, these are the right wing, etc., which they are, but there will be people within it who can be won over to a more democratic outlook. And, you know, people are not born reactionary, not born to, you know, oppress the Palestinians. People can change their mind. And that's what we're socialists for, isn't it? Thank you very much, Moshé. Fascinating. Very enjoyable, very informative and educational. Comrades, I hope some of you will join us in our new education series, Why Marx, which is on every Thursday at 7 p.m. And now you've signed up to this meeting, you'll get an invite per email if you haven't had one. Thank you very much, comrades. Have a good evening. Thank you, Moshé. Bye-bye.